Over dinner, my daughter put down her fork, looked me in the eye, and said, "Dad, you have no class." No raised voice, no laughter to soften it. Just the precision of a blade slipped between the ribs without warning. I felt the words land before I even tasted my next bite. Across the table, my wife's eyes dropped to her plate, her fingers tightening around the edge as if holding it in place could stop the moment from tilting. The chandelier's warm light suddenly felt too sharp, carving every wrinkle in my hands, the same hands that once fixed the very crystal glass my daughter now lifted with careless elegance. She held it the way people hold things they believe they've earned but never had to fight for. I didn't answer, not because I couldn't, but because some insults don't need to be met with noise. They need to be met with time. I let the sentence sit there between us, like an uninvited guest refusing to leave. My knife rested untouched against the plate. The meat had cooled, but the air between us was burning. She kept eating, chatting about some gala she'd been invited to, about champagne fountains and hand-stitched gowns. Her fiancé chimed in, throwing in words like exclusive and elevated as if they were seasoning to impress the table. But my mind wasn't in that room anymore. It was in the years behind me, the years of patched suits, double shifts, and cold mornings spent making sure there was always food on this table, whether it sat on fine china or dented tin. She'd grown up never hearing the creak of an empty cupboard, never knowing the weight of unpaid bills in a man's pocket. She thought class was something you bought. I knew better. It was something you bled for. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow our channel. All right, let's continue. I took a sip of water, slow and steady, while her words kept replaying in my head. Not as a wound, but as a warning. Quiet doesn't mean consent, it means preparation. And though she didn't know it yet, I was already preparing for the day she would hear my name. Not in this dining room, but in a boardroom where class isn't measured by crystal glasses, but by the weight of the vote that carries it. On Monday, I reached for the old navy suit, hanging at the far end of my closet. The fabric was tired, its elbows polished to a dull shine from years of leaning over desks, handshakes, and long nights spent convincing people to take a chance on something that didn't yet exist. It wasn't a suit you wore to impress. It was a suit you wore to remember. Every thread in it carried the smell of rain-soaked sidewalks and the weight of promises I once made to myself and kept. The mirror didn't flatter it, but I wasn't looking for flattery. I wanted to feel the roughness of those early days against my skin, to remind myself what real class looks like when it's stripped of applause and polished surfaces. The kind you carry into a room, not on your shoulders, but in the way you stand, in the way you stay. When I walked into the building, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Not the faint oil and paper of the old days, but the sterile scent of glass cleaner and ambition polished for show. The receptionist was new, young, crisp, and glazed over with that professional brightness that sees right through you unless your name means something to her. She didn't know mine. She slid a badge across the counter without looking up for long, the kind of glance that sizes you up and files you under temporary. The lobby art was still there. Same abstract painting, same frame, only now it looked smaller against the new marble walls, like history being swallowed by its own reinvention. I stood there for a moment, not because I cared about the painting, but because I remembered the day we'd hung it, back when the walls were still bare drywall, and the only thing polished in this place was the determination in our eyes. In the conference hallway, voices murmured behind glass doors. Men with smoother shoes and flatter voices spoke about efficiency and streamlining, words that sound noble until you realize they're just the polite uniform of greed. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. I walked past, letting their words pass over me like a light drizzle, catching the pieces worth keeping. I've learned over the years that the most valuable things in a room are not the documents on the table, but the fragments that slip out between guarded sentences. A phrase, a number, a hesitation. I stored them quietly, the way I once saved bolts and screws from broken machines. never knowing exactly when I'd use them, but knowing I would. That day, I wasn't there to make noise. I was there to watch, to remember, and to wait. Because rooms change, titles change, even people change, but the foundation remembers. And I was part of the foundation, whether they liked it or not. When they remodeled the headquarters, the architects called it a modern transformation. I called it something else, a debt of gratitude that would never be repaid. My donation, written quietly on a check with no ceremony, bought the glass walls that now sliced the building into sleek corridors of light. I remember the day they first stood, tall and clean, catching the sun like frozen rivers. Back then, I didn't care if my name was etched into a plaque. I wasn't building for applause. I was building because the company needed to grow, and I had the means to make it happen. My daughter was a teenager then, curious, full of questions, always wanting to visit my office. She would run her fingertips along those cold, perfect panels, watching her reflection stretch and ripple as she walked. She called them magic walls. I used to watch her smile in those moments, thinking, hoping, that she understood what they really stood for. They weren't just glass. They were proof that sacrifices made in silence could create beauty for others to walk through. But years have a way of reshaping how people see things. Somewhere along the line, she stopped remembering the story behind those walls and started believing they had always been there, that their shine was simply part of the world she was entitled to. She learned to confuse the gleam of surfaces with the weight of substance. She mistook gloss for class. And when she looked at me, in my older suits and worn shoes, she saw a man who no longer matched the rooms he had once helped build. The sting of that realization was sharper than I expected, not because I needed her recognition, but because I had given her a legacy she could touch and walk through. Yet she believed it had sprung from nowhere, clean, perfect, without the sweat and grit that had paid for it. It's easy to love the shine when you've never stood in the dark waiting for the sun to rise. So I let that sting stay with me, like a splinter under the skin, not to dwell in bitterness, but to mark the line between what can be forgotten and what must be remembered, between what people claim as theirs and what they must be shown is yours. Because class isn't in the glass, it's in the hands that raised it from nothing. And one day she would learn that, not from my words, but from the weight of a moment she couldn't ignore. I never talked about my shares. In a world where people measure themselves by what they can display, silence is often mistaken for emptiness, but silence has its own kind of weight, and mine sat quietly in the bottom drawer of my desk, in a thin envelope no one ever asked about. A small, stubborn percentage of the company, born not from inheritance or negotiation tricks, but from years when my back ached, my hands cracked, and my name was still more of a gamble than a guarantee. Most people think sweat buys applause. They imagine hard work ending in a stage, a spotlight, and a polite speech thanking them for their contributions. It doesn't. Sweat buys you something less shiny, but far more permanent, ownership. Not just of paper or percentages, but of the right to walk into a room and know you belong there, whether they remember your name or not. That envelope had been with me for decades. I never waved it around to prove anything. I never used it to press an advantage. It wasn't a weapon, it was a truth. And truths don't always need to shout. They just need to exist, quietly, until the day they're called forward. It's strange how something so small can carry so much history. Inside those few pages were the nights I stayed after everyone went home, repairing machines by hand, because the budget wouldn't stretch to new ones. They held the weeks I went without a paycheck so the junior staff could get theirs. They held every decision where I bet on people instead of numbers, and won just enough times to keep going. I'd never thought much about when or how I might need to use that stake. It was like a fuse, coiled, patient, invisible under the surface. A fuse doesn't announce itself. It doesn't brag about what it can do. It just waits, silent and certain, knowing that when the moment comes, it will change everything in an instant. And lately I could feel the air thickening, the kind of quiet pressure that builds before a match is struck. I didn't yet know who would light it, but I knew I wouldn't be the one running when the spark came. He arrived like a storm dressed in a tailored suit, my daughter's fiancé, a man whose confidence moved ahead of him like a herald announcing his entrance. His grin was the kind that felt pre-signed, like a deal already closed, a victory already claimed. When he shook my hand for the first time, it was firm enough to be polite, but not enough to leave an impression, like a man trained to touch the world without truly feeling it. He called me sir in public, legend once in jest, but there was no respect in the way he said it. The words felt like decorative flourishes, tokens of civility that cost him nothing. The first time he came to the house, I was in the garden, dirt under my nails, work boots worn thin from years of use. He laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, but in that quiet, polished way that says more than words ever could. "I didn't know you still worked like that," he said, eyes on the mud. It was subtle at first, the way he reshaped her speech. The girl who once told me about the people she met and the ideas she dreamed up began talking instead about quarterly horizons and cumulative gains. She spoke in numbers now, clean and abstract, no fingerprints of humanity on them. I realized he was teaching her a new language, one spoken fluently at a certain kind of table, a table that measured worth in return on investment and saw sentiment as inefficiency. I knew those tables. I had sat at some in my time, though never for long. I'd learned early that not all chairs are worth fighting to keep. But my daughter didn't know that yet. She wanted to belong, to be welcomed into a circle that wore power like fine cologne, that nodded approvingly at her polished smile without ever seeing the girl who once trailed her fingers along the glass walls I'd paid for. And the more I watched, the more I saw the shift. Her laughter changed, less spontaneous, more curated. Her stories were no longer about the lives being changed by the work she did, but about the doors being opened by the company she kept. The chair I had built for her, carved from years of sacrifice and unglamorous labor, was no longer enough. She wanted a seat at their table, not realizing that their table would never value the hands that made hers. It hurt in a way I didn't expect. Not because I was jealous of her new life, but because I could see so clearly what she couldn't. That in chasing their approval, she was learning to treat my kind of worth as a relic, something to be admired politely and then set aside. And yet I said nothing. Because some truths aren't taught by words. They're taught by the moments when the ground shifts and the tables turn and the chair you thought was yours is pulled away. I could feel that moment coming, and when it did, I knew exactly where I'd be, still standing, my hands steady, my stake in place, waiting for the day she would hear my name spoken where it mattered, not at their table, but at mine. It began quietly, like a draft slipping under a closed door, too faint to notice at first until it chilled the whole room. My name, once spoken with warmth or respect, started appearing in sentences that felt rehearsed, smoothed down to the point of emptiness. I was difficult, they said, dated, not aligned with brand values, words that sound professional enough to pass in daylight but carry the same weight as a knife in the dark. The changes came slowly, almost politely. Invitations to events where my presence had once been assumed began arriving late or not at all. Meetings were rescheduled to off-cycle times, which meant they happened without me. And when I did attend, I could feel the subtle choreography of avoidance. The way conversations shifted when I joined, the sudden need to circle back later on topics that once upon a time I had helped define. My daughter started speaking differently, too. The cadence wasn't hers anymore, it belonged to someone else. The words rolled off her tongue in smooth, deliberate patterns, like she was reading from a script that had been handed to her by someone who wanted me on the outside looking in. Synergy, positioning, market optics, phrases polished enough to blind you if you weren't careful. But I've learned over the years that polish is often used to cover cracks, and when you ask those words to carry weight, to actually lift something real, they tend to crumble in your hands. I understood what was happening. I just didn't react, not the way they wanted. I didn't fight for scraps of relevance or demand an audience. I let the silence stretch, and in that silence they thought they saw surrender. But silence is not the same as absence. It's a space where you gather strength, where you choose your ground and wait for the right moment to stand on it. Betrayal rarely comes crashing through the front door. It slips in through meetings you weren't invited to, decisions made in your best interest, and polite emails that end with "appreciate your understanding." It's not loud. It's not messy. It arrives dressed in perfect grammar, shaking your hand with one palm while the other quietly rewrites the story. And so I let them keep rewriting, for now, because I knew something they didn't. Stories have turning points, and mine was already on the horizon. All I had to do was keep still, let them believe the ink was dry, and wait for the page to turn. The engagement party was all light and glass, and the faint scent of expensive flowers that had never grown in soil. Everything gleamed, the chandeliers, the marble floors, the camera flashes catching every smile. It was the kind of room where appearances weighed more than truth, and the air was thick with the curated ease of people who believed they were winning at life. I stayed near the edges, not because I didn't belong, but because I wanted to see the whole stage before the play began. When he finally stood, glass in hand, the room shifted toward him like iron toward a magnet. His suit was flawless, his smile trained, his voice carrying the kind of false warmth that people mistake for charm. He spoke about their journey together, about their shared vision, about building a future on strong values. And then, with the same easy rhythm, he slid the blade in. "To those who taught us what not to be," he said, lifting his glass higher. The words hung in the air, light enough to pass for wit, sharp enough to draw blood. A ripple of laughter followed, quick, glittering, and cold. It moved through the crowd like broken glass catching champagne light. My eyes didn't leave him, but my ears heard the absence, the silence where my daughter's voice should have been. She didn't laugh. She didn't look at me either. Her gaze fixed somewhere far away, on nothing in particular, as if pretending she hadn't heard would erase the sound. Beside me, my wife's hand trembled against mine, the small, involuntary shake of someone holding back both anger and hurt. I closed my fingers over hers, pressing once, slow and steady. It was my way of telling her what I couldn't say out loud in that moment. Not here. Not yet. Steel stayed sheathed. That was the choice. I could have spoken then. Could have cut through the room with words sharp enough to leave every glass trembling. But that would have been a release, not a victory. And victory wasn't what I wanted. I wanted the truth to land where it would leave a mark that couldn't be laughed away. So I swallowed the moment, letting it settle into that deep, still place inside me, where every slight and every betrayal waits, patient and intact. Let them toast their cleverness. Let them mistake my silence for weakness. The blade they had just drawn had two edges, and they didn't even see the one pointing back at them. In that glittering room, under the hum of polite applause and the clinking of crystal, I wasn't losing ground. I was marking it, inch by inch, in silence, until the day I decided to claim it back. And when that day came, I wouldn't be standing at the edge of the room. I'd be at the center, with their laughter gone quiet, and my name impossible to ignore. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipped into my mail slot like any other piece of routine correspondence. But the moment I saw the header, the company seal pressed into the paper, I knew it was no routine matter. The board docket, the quiet heart of decisions that shape the future while pretending to protect the past. I sat down at my desk, the same desk where that thin envelope with my stake still waited, untouched but never forgotten, and began to read. Item 7. The words were dressed well, polished, dignified, the kind of legal prose designed to put a man to sleep if he didn't know what to look for. Consolidate legacy shares under a new class of leadership equity. Harmless at first glance, even progressive, as if they were simply updating old structures for a brighter, more efficient future. But I knew the scent of rot beneath a fresh coat of paint. This wasn't restructuring. This was erasure. The math was clean in its cruelty. If passed, the motion would take my weighted voting power, built over decades, earned in ways most of them could never stomach, and dissolve it into a new, streamlined class of shares with no teeth, no leverage, a polite cough at the end of a meeting instead of a voice that could change its course. On paper, I'd still be an owner, In truth, I'd be an audience member. They had chosen their timing well, or so they thought. Friday, last item on the agenda before cocktails. A moment when people's minds are already halfway to the clink of ice in a glass, to soft laughter and lighter topics. A motion they could slip through with minimal friction, a nod here, a signature there. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, it would be done. Signed, filed, irreversible. But timing is a double-edged thing. If they thought they were scheduling my exit, they didn't understand me at all. I marked the date, not with the bitterness of a man backed into a corner, but with the calm precision of someone preparing to walk into the exact fight he's been training for all his life. That Friday, they had scheduled my erasure. I scheduled my dignity for the same hour. And while they saw an old man with fading relevance, I saw a room full of people about to be reminded that some foundations can't be swept away with a vote. Some names, when spoken in the right place, have weight you can't reduce to a new class of equity. The docket went back into its envelope. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the old wood creak beneath me. They thought they had written the ending. They hadn't even seen the middle yet. On Wednesday morning, I reached for the phone. Not the sleek black one the company had given me years ago, but the heavy, old landline that still sat on the corner of my desk like an anchor to a different time. I didn't need a directory. I didn't need to check if the numbers were still valid. Some connections live in your bones. You dial them by memory, not habit. The first call went to a man whose invoices I had once paid early, in the dead of that first winter when the bank refused to extend our credit. He had been just a supplier on paper, but we both knew better. He'd been the rope that kept us from slipping under. When he heard my voice, there was no polite hesitation, no guarded curiosity, only a pause thick with recognition. I told him what was coming, and I didn't need to ask for anything specific. Loyalty doesn't need a shopping list. It knows what to bring to the table. The second call was to the union rep I had once faced across a metal table during a week-long standoff. That winter, the factory floor was cold enough to frost breath, and the air was so sharp with distrust you could cut it. I hadn't flinched then, hadn't hidden behind lawyers or empty promises. We came out of that week not as friends, but as men who understood each other's worth. When I told him about the vote, I could almost hear the weight of old battles shifting back into place. The third call was the quietest, but perhaps the most important. A client whose lights I had kept on during a blizzard, literally. We'd driven through snow so thick it erased the world beyond the headlights, carrying parts in the back of my truck because waiting until Monday would have meant shutting them down for good. Back then it was about survival. Now it was about remembering who had stood in the dark with them. These were not people who wore power on their sleeves. They didn't sit on panels or decorate magazine covers, but they carried something rarer, memory. And memory is a currency the polished crowd will never counterfeit. You can fake charm, you can rent influence, but you can't buy the kind of knowing that comes from watching a man bleed for something without asking for applause. By Thursday night, the boardroom that had been arranged to my exclusion began to shift. Extra chairs appeared, reserved without fanfare, their presence unexplained in the official seating chart. Someone had remembered the foundation, and they'd made sure it had a place in the room. The people who thought they could corner me didn't know that walls only work if the ground beneath them is loyal. They believed Friday's vote would be a clean sweep. I knew it would be a reminder, one they wouldn't see coming until my name was called, and by then it would be too late to pretend they hadn't heard it. On Friday, the air felt different before I even stepped inside. The city was still shaking off the early morning chill, the kind that lingers even when the sun has started to climb. I arrived at the building earlier than anyone expected me, early enough to see the janitor polishing the lobby floor, the same man who once stopped me in this very hallway to thank me for keeping him on during the leanest winter. We nodded to each other, wordless, but the recognition passed between us like a quiet blessing. The boardroom doors were still shut when I reached them. I didn't wait for anyone to open them for me. My hand on the cold metal handle, I pushed through, letting the sound announce my arrival before my voice ever would. I didn't head for the table, not yet. Instead, I took a seat in the second row, close enough to see every expression, far enough to remind them that a man doesn't need to sit at the head to hold the room. It's an old truth most of them have forgotten. Power mistakes humility for weakness. It sees a man sitting quietly, dressed without the flash of current fashion, and assumes he's been pushed to the margins. But power rarely looks over its shoulder until it hears footsteps. And mine were coming. When the fiancé saw me, the corner of his mouth curled in that practiced, effortless smirk, the kind that says he's already decided the ending. He glanced toward my daughter, as if to confirm I was where he wanted me, off the main stage watching instead of speaking. She didn't smile. She didn't even frown. She looked at me as though I were part of the furniture, something in the room, but not of it, something she could look past without consequence. I felt no rush to change her mind. Truth has its own clock, and it never hurries for the comfort of others. I sat with my hands folded loosely in my lap, the faintest smile on my face. Not a challenge, not submission, but the quiet confidence of a man who knows he doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Around us, the board members began to file in, their conversations hushed and fragmented, carrying the low hum of anticipation. Some of them avoided my eyes. Others gave me polite nods without warmth. I returned each nod slowly, letting the weight of my gaze rest just long enough to remind them I was not a guest here. The clock on the far wall ticked toward the hour. Outside, somewhere far below the glass windows, the city kept moving, unaware that in this room, a different kind of weather was about to break. They thought they had arranged the day for my quiet exit, but I was here, seated where they thought I couldn't matter, waiting for the moment when the ground under their feet would shift. Because the truth doesn't rush, but it always arrives, and when it does, it doesn't knock, it opens its own door. The meeting began like a performance they had rehearsed to perfection. The lights dimmed just enough to give the screen center stage, and one by one, the board's chosen voices took their turn, presenting charts polished until they shone like mirrors. Lines climbed upward, curves dipped gracefully, and every number was wrapped in language so sleek it could slide past you without leaving a mark. Efficiency, optimization, shareholder confidence. They spoke as though progress were something that could be contained entirely within a graph, as though the heart of the company could be reduced to percentages. I listened, not because I believed their numbers, but because I knew what they were leaving out. Numbers are neat, lives are not. And while they showed the smooth surface, I carried the grain of the wood beneath it, the knots and scars that had kept the whole thing from splintering. When they were done, the room waited for the next item on the docket. That was when I rose, not fast, not with a flourish, but the way an old tree might straighten after years of bending in the wind. No one called on me. No one had to. "I don't have charts," I began, my voice even but carrying. "I have names." I let the silence after that stretch, long enough for the polite smiles to falter. The night shift foreman who pulled a man out from under a failing press, saving his life without stopping the line. The receptionist who sold her wedding ring during the downturn so the junior staff could eat that month. The janitor who taught me to hear machines breathe so we could fix them before they broke. I didn't rush. Each name, each story was laid down like a stone on a path they had forgotten they once walked. I wanted them to feel the weight, not of sentiment, but of proof. Because these weren't anecdotes. They were the spine of the company. And unlike their graphs, these stories couldn't be smoothed over or scaled down. They bled, and in that bleeding was the truth. "Class," I said finally, letting my eyes sweep the room, "is not an accent. It's a record." I didn't mean a document or a ledger you could file away. I meant the living ledger, the one written in the calluses on hands, in the nights worked without sleep, in the choices that put people before profit when it mattered most. For a moment, no one spoke. You could hear the hum of the overhead lights, the faint creak of a chair as someone shifted uncomfortably. The charts on the screen were still there, pristine and untouched, but they looked suddenly thin, as if the light behind them had dimmed. I didn't sit back down right away. I let the pause linger, because the truth, once spoken, needs space to settle in the air. And in that space I could feel the room change, just a degree, just enough. The mirror they had polished so carefully now had a crack running through it, and I'd put it there. They thought the moment for opposition had passed. The charts had been shown, the polite speeches made, and now the chairman's voice slid smoothly into the final act. "We'll move to a vote," he said, as though the outcome were already carved into stone. People shifted forward in their chairs, pens poised, eyes already halfway toward the door where cocktails and congratulations waited. That was when I stood. Not abruptly, not in anger, just enough to tilt the room. The scrape of my chair against the polished floor was louder than I expected, or maybe it only felt that way because every head turned toward me in unison. "Before you tally," I said, my voice cutting clean through the murmurs, "check Article 9, subsection C, the legacy conversion provision." For a split second, there was only stillness, the kind that follows when someone drops an unfamiliar word into a language you thought you spoke fluently. Then the motion began, sharp, quick, restless, heads bent, legal pads flipped, laptops opened. I saw the general counsel's brows pull together as his fingers moved faster over the keyboard, the glow of the screen lighting his face like the beginning of a storm. It had been years since I'd written that clause into the bylaws, in a negotiation so quiet most of them never knew it happened. A protection, I'd called it then. Not for me, but for the founders who would come after me. A fuse, wound carefully, hidden deep in the architecture of the company, waiting for the day someone tried to dismantle what we'd built without understanding what held it together. The words were simple enough, dusty and patient from years of disuse. Any motion altering founder equity shall, upon proposal, trigger conversion of silent shares into weighted votes at a ratio of 3-1. It meant that the stake I had kept tucked away all these years, unremarkable to those who only counted its face value, now stood taller than any of their holdings. What they had planned as a polite reduction of my voice had just become an amplification they couldn't outvote. My name, once written in ink at the bottom of a contract they thought time had buried, now stepped back into the room in iron. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The paper spoke for me. The chairman cleared his throat, trying to smooth the edge from his tone, but the tension was already climbing the walls. Across the table, the fiancé's smirk had frozen mid-curve, and my daughter's eyes, finally, fully, found mine. She didn't speak, but in that moment, I knew she understood something. I had not been absent. I had been watching, waiting, holding the kind of power that doesn't need to posture to exist. I sat back down slowly, my hands calm in my lap. Around me, the sound of shuffling papers and whispered questions filled the air, like the rustle of leaves before a storm. The vote would still come. But now, the weight in the room had shifted, and all I had done was remind them of the rules they'd agreed to, long before they thought I'd matter again. The chairman's throat cleared, but it wasn't the confident sound of a man in control. It was tight, almost reluctant, like he was swallowing something bitter before he spoke. "The weighted votes will be read aloud," he announced, and the air in the room seemed to contract. The words didn't just signal a process. They signaled the unraveling of the plan they'd all walked in expecting to execute with ease. The secretary glanced down at the ledger, pen in hand, her usual composure now shadowed by something closer to caution. One by one, the names began, and then mine. Spoken clearly, without the perfunctory politeness I'd grown accustomed to over the last few years. "I, Mr. My name traveled across the room, heavy enough to be heard even in the spaces between heartbeats. It happened again and again. Each time my name was attached to a vote, the room shifted almost imperceptibly, shoulders straightened, eyes darted, someone's pen stopped moving mid-note. Every "I, Mr." turned the temperature up by a degree, melting the veneer of certainty they'd worn so well at the start of the meeting. I didn't look at the fiancé. I didn't need to. I could feel his stare, sharp and searching, as though trying to find the moment in the past he'd missed, the one where he might have realized I wasn't just an aging relic sitting quietly on the sidelines. His silence was louder than any defense he could have mounted. But my daughter, I did look at her. For the first time that morning, her eyes met mine without sliding away. There was something there now, something restless and conflicted, Pride, yes, but tangled in panic. And beneath it, love. Love wrestling with the scaffolding of the world she had borrowed from someone else. A world built on different values, different measures of worth. She didn't smile, didn't nod, but I saw the flicker, small but unmistakable, of understanding. She was beginning to see what they had all forgotten, that class, power, and dignity don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they enter quietly, sit in the second row, and wait for the moment when a single name can shift the entire balance of a room. The votes continued, my name called again and again, each repetition driving the point deeper, not just into the record, but into the memory of everyone present. The outcome was no longer in question. The only question now was how many would remember this day for what it truly was. By the time the tally was complete, the room felt smaller, the air heavier, as though the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. I hadn't raised my voice once, but my name had been spoken enough times to make it impossible to forget. And that, more than the numbers on any ledger, was the real victory. Motion fails. 2 words, clean and final, falling into the air like the first drops of a rainstorm that washes dust from stone. There was no fanfare, no dramatic gasp, just the quiet click of inevitability. Yet in that quiet I could feel the entire map of the room redraw itself. Lines that had seemed fixed only minutes ago dissolved, and the terrain shifted beneath the polished shoes of people who thought they knew exactly where they stood. The fiancé's grin, so careful, so constant, slipped away as if someone had cut the thread holding it in place. It didn't crumble in anger or melt in embarrassment. It simply vanished, leaving behind the bare face of a man who had just learned the ground he was standing on was not his to claim. His eyes flickered from me to my daughter, searching for something he could still control. He found nothing. Around the table, the reactions fractured. A few people clapped, quick and small, like they were swatting away the discomfort of the moment. Most didn't move, their hands still on their pens, their eyes pretending to stay on the docket even as their minds scrambled to adjust to the new reality. I could almost hear the recalculations in the room, who they'd stand beside, who they'd distance from, how they'd explain away the fact that they'd underestimated the man they'd tried to write out. I didn't gloat. Victory that needs gloating is a shallow kind, and mine had been years in the making. Instead, I let my gaze find my daughter's across the space between us. It wasn't a glare, and it wasn't a plea. It was steady, deliberate, the kind of look that says, "Now you see it." She held my eyes longer than I expected. In them, I saw a struggle, the pride that wanted to rise, the panic that didn't know where to go, and beneath both, the fragile beginnings of respect. I had not argued with her over dinner that night, had not defended myself when she called me a man without class. But here, in the silence after 2 words had undone an entire scheme, she was crossing back toward something she hadn't realized she'd left behind. The space between us wasn't closed by speeches or apologies. It was crossed by something quieter, a bridge built from silence and steel, from the knowledge that some fights are won without a raised voice, without a slammed fist, without a single step toward the podium. As the meeting moved on, pretending to regain its rhythm, I sat back in my chair, not in triumph, but in certainty. The map had been redrawn, and this time my name was not on the margins. It was carved into the center, where they would have to walk past it every time they came into this room. The meeting dissolved the way all such meetings do. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped, voices dropped back into small talk to cover the weight of what had just happened. But I didn't linger. I stood, slow and steady, and walked toward the door without glancing back. My name was still in the air, not loud anymore, but settled into the walls like something permanent, something they couldn't sand away no matter how many times they painted over it. The hallway outside still smelled faintly of fresh paint from the renovation a decade ago, the one my money had helped make possible. The light from the tall glass panels fell across the floor in long, clean lines, just as it had the first day they'd been installed. I had walked through here then, with my daughter's small hand in mine, her eyes wide, her fingertips grazing the cold, perfect surface like it was magic. Now I heard footsteps behind me, quick at first, then slowing. She was there, No cameras, no audience, just her. She stopped in front of me, and for a moment she didn't speak. Her eyes searched mine, not for permission, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Dad! Her voice was softer than I'd heard it in years. I was wrong. I didn't ask about what. I didn't make her list it all out. The words at the dinner table, the silences in meetings, the way she had looked through me instead of at me. I just nodded once. Class, I said quietly, isn't about the rooms you enter. It's about how you leave them. Something in her posture changed then. Not much, just enough to let the air between us settle differently. She stepped closer, and her hand found my arm, the way it had when she was a girl. And in that small gesture, I felt something more valuable than vindication. I felt the bridge between us strengthen, not built from victory, but from the truth she could no longer ignore. We walked out together, past the glass walls and the polished marble, past the people pretending not to watch us. My name still echoed from the vote, not in volume, but in permanence, a quiet mark that would stay as long as the building stood. Outside, the air was cool and open, carrying none of the stale politics of the room we'd left behind. For the first time in a long time, we moved in step. And in that silence between us, dignity and love, two things that had spoken different languages for too many years, finally began to speak the same one.